Our final lecture for this session is on the female genitalia. Of course, we're going to review quickly the anatomy and physiology. Then we're going to learn about the different findings in the history and physical examination. Then we're going to tackle some of the concepts for health promotion. Let's quickly review the anatomy. The term for the external female genitalia is the vulva. So the vulva consists of the following parts. The hair-covered fat part is called the mons pubis. It has two lips, an outer lip and an inner lip. The outer lip is called the labia majora, while the inner lip is called the labia minora. And the anterior-superior part is where the clitoris is located. The vestibule is the area between the labia minora, which contains the vaginal opening called the introitus, as well as the urethral meatus. The perineum is all that space in between the introitus and the anus. Women have various vulvovaginal glands. The urethral meatus opens into the vestibule. The openings of the paraurethral glands are located just posterior and adjacent to the meatus on either side. In contrast, the Bartholin glands are located posteriorly on both sides of the vaginal opening, and these are not usually visible. However, it's pointed here in our diagram where the location of the Bartholin glands are. Of course, women also have the vagina and the uterus. The vagina is a musculomembranous tube extending to the fornix. It's here. Oh, it's here. While the uterus is a thick-walled, pear-shaped structure with three layers, an outer perimetrium, a middle myometrium, and an inner endometrium. The upper surface is called the fundus, the main body is called the corpus, while the opening towards the vagina is called the cervix. The cervix protrudes into the vagina. It has an outer surface called the ectocervix, which has a central opening called an external os. Os just means mouth in Latin, right? It's covered by two types of epithelium. A columnar epithelium, which is red in color, and a shiny pink outer squamous epithelium. Its boundary is what we call the squamo-columnar junction. The squamo-columnar junction creates the transformation zone, and it is the area sampled during a pap smear. Okay? The adnexae refers to those that are the limbs of the uterus, so to speak. The adnexa refers to the ovaries, the fallopian tubes, and the supporting tissues. The ovaries produce the oocytes and secrete the hormones estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone, while the fallopian tubes conduct the oocyte from the ovary into the uterus. The pelvic organs are supported by the pelvic floor. The pelvic floor is composed of muscles, ligaments, and fascia. It helps in sexual function, continence, and joint stabilization. So, any weakness in the pelvic floor could lead to pain, urinary or fecal incontinence, as well as pelvic organ prolapse, a condition which is common among elderly women, especially those that have been pregnant multiple times. Okay, so the components of the pelvic floor include the pelvic diaphragm and the perineal membrane. The pelvic diaphragm separates the pelvic cavity from the perineum. It consists of two muscles, the levator ani and the coccygeal muscles, while the perineal membrane is a triangular sheet of fibromuscular tissue that anchors the urethra, vagina, as well as the perineal body. This slide outlines some of the common symptoms that you need to ask for during your health history. Most important, of course, for women is the menstrual history. Just look at some of the terms in the next slide. Menarche is the age at onset of menses. So you just ask in Filipino, kailan po kayo unang niregla o kailan po kayo unang dinatnan? Dysmenorrhea is pain with menses, often with cramping in the lower abdomen or pelvis. Masakit po ba? But of course, most people would be familiar or most women would be familiar with the term dysmenorrhea. Another term is the premenstrual syndrome or PMS. It's a cluster of emotional, behavioral, and physical symptoms that happen 5 days before menses for 3 consecutive weeks. Amenorrhea is the absence or lack of menses. Amenorrhea can be divided between primary or secondary menses. Primary menses means they have never had any menses. So this happens, for example, in some syndromic patients, those with intersex. In contrast, secondary amenorrhea is those with cessation after establishment. For example, those who have early menopause. Okay, so you need to ask, how do you clarify that? When the patient complains that they haven't had any menses ever, you ask them, have you ever had menses before? As simple as that. Another related term is abnormal uterine bleeding. It's bleeding in between menses. So menses normally happen every 28 days, right? But if there's any bleeding between those periods, then we call that abnormal uterine bleeding. Okay? So the abnormality could be excessive, prolonged, or even postmenopausal bleeding, and that warrants further investigation. Okay? But I'm just introducing to you the term AUB right now, but later on during your OB rotation, you're going to learn about the different differentials for abnormal uterine bleeding. Menopause is the absence of menses for 12 consecutive months, usually occurring between ages 48 and 55. Lastly, we have postmenopausal bleeding, bleeding occurring 6 months or more after the cessation of menses. Okay, so what are some of the issues that you have to consider? For example, if someone has dysmenorrhea, what are you going to consider? It could be an organic cause, such as endometriosis, pelvic inflammatory disease, or endometrial polyps. Primary dysmenorrhea usually results from increased prostaglandin production. In other words, it could be part of normal menstruation, or it could have an organic, more specific condition that needs to be addressed. For premenstrual syndrome, it includes symptoms such as depression, irritability, anxiety, bloating, and aches. So, diagnosis requires 5 days prior to menses for at least 3 consecutive cycles. And an important aspect is that it already interferes with your day-to-day activities. So, you need to ask the patient, how have these symptoms affected their day-to-day functioning? Here are some abnormal bleeding patterns. Now, admittedly, OB with their clinical practice guidelines may have different terms. So it's important that you learn in your OB rotation what their actual criteria are. But I'm introducing to you some of the terms located in found in our BATES, which is our reference book. Polymenorrhea, poly means many. It just means less than 21 days intervals between menses. In contrast, oligomenorrhea, oligo means infrequent. It means infrequent bleeding, meaning it's taking longer than it doesn't happen all the time. So, for example, if you have athletes that are very low fat mass, then they could have oligomenorrhea. Menorrhagia refers to excessive flow, while metrorrhagia refers to intermenstrual bleeding. Now, admittedly, both of these terms are already outdated, but you're still going to find them in some books. Okay. Postcoital bleeding is bleeding after intercourse. It could be suggestive of cervical polyps or cancer. The causes of abnormal bleeding may vary by age, and it could include pregnancy, infection, cancer, polyps, fibroids, bleeding disorders, or hormonal therapies. Menopause happens again between 48 and 55 years old. There's a transition period called perimenopause. So here, the cycle length starts to vary, and there are also vasomotor symptoms, what we call hot flashes. The estrogen levels start to drop, leading to symptoms such as vaginal dryness, mood shifts, and bone loss. So if there's any bleeding after menopause, it's not that it's never going to be that the menstruation is returning. So it's already a possible sign for cancer that needs to be investigated. So for the pregnancy history, you have the Gravida Para system. So here's the notation. So for example, if you have a G1P11001, what does that mean? It means that um the woman has been pregnant a total of one time. Okay? Para means the patient gave birth one time. 1001 means um that the patient has given birth full term and the child is still living up to now. Okay, so the 1001 refers to the FPAL or TPAL, meaning term, premature, abortion, or living. So the first number indicates the number of full term births, the second indicates the number of premature births, the third indicates the number of abortions, whether it is spontaneous or induced. As you will learn later on, not all abortions are secondary to induced abortion. And lastly, the last number or the fourth number refers to the number of living children. So that's what the gravida para system means. What are some of the other things you need to ask for in the history? Could ask for sexual health, but remember to always maintain a neutral, non-judgmental tone so that the patient is going to feel safe. So for example, when you're going to ask about sexual orientation and gender identity, don't ask loaded questions such as, do you have a boyfriend? Do you have a husband? you should always ask neutral questions. Are you currently dating? Are you sexually active? How you describe your gender identity? Of course, you could ask that. Um, Second would be sexual response. You need to assess all phases of the sexual response, starting from desire. Do you have any desire to engage in sexual intercourse? Arousal, which involves lubrication, and lastly, orgasm. It's because um some women may suffer problems in a certain phase only of the sexual response. For example, um, with decreasing age, some patients may exhibit decreased vaginal secretions that could lead to decreased lubrication during sex, and that could contribute actually to painful sex, right? And lastly, you could ask for sexual dysfunction. Dysfunction refers to the lack of desire, failure of arousal, or an inability to reach orgasm. In other words, sexual dysfunction could happen at any phase of the sexual response. It's not necessarily just being unable to reach orgasm. That's just one aspect of it. Okay? So, for sexual dysfunction, we have various terms. As I have mentioned earlier, there could be dyspareunia. Dyspareunia means pain when it comes to intercourse. Vaginismus is an involuntary spasm of vaginal muscles. So when the woman complains of pelvic pain, we could differentiate it between acute pelvic pain and chronic pelvic pain. A pelvic pain of sudden onset that is extreme in nature could be acute pelvic pain. Differentials there include life-threatening conditions such as ectopic pregnancy, which means the fetus is located outside of the uterus, ovarian torsion, meaning the blood supply to the ovaries are being cut off because of twisting or torsion, or it could also be appendicitis. But the most common cause of acute pelvic pain is a form of, which can be possibly related to sexually transmitted disease, is a pelvic inflammatory disease. But of course, it's most important to always rule out the life-threatening cause, which is ectopic pregnancy. Okay, so how do you rule out for that? Well, you could do, of course, an ultrasound. In contrast to acute pelvic pain, the patient may be experiencing it for already a long time. It could be that the patient's pain is already lasting up to 6 months. In that case, it's called a chronic pelvic pain. So more than half of women who report chronic pelvic pain are going to have endometriosis, meaning the inner lining of the uterus has thickened. The endometrium is thickened. Okay? Inflammatory disease could also lead to chronic pelvic pain, as well as adenosis, adenomyosis, and fibroids. Chronic pain is a red flag for a history as well of sexual abuse. So you need to rule that out during your history taking. An important health promotion topic for women is screening for cervical cancer. If you would recall, what's the most important risk factor for cervical cancer is actually the presence of human papilloma virus, specifically the high risk subtypes HPV 16 and 18. When do we begin screening? We begin screening 21 years old and above, or whenever is the onset of sexual activity. Okay? Um, How do we do it? We perform it using a pap smear every 3 years. And take note that once the patient reaches 30 years old, we could also perform HPV cytology plus HPV testing every 5 years. And when do we end screening? We end at around 65 years old. Okay? And of course, if the patient no longer has any cervix, if the patient's uterus have been removed, then there's no need to perform any hysterectomy at whatever age that may be. So in order to prevent cervical cancer, you could give the patients the HPV vaccine. So who needs to receive the HPV vaccine? All girls as well as boys at ages 11 or 12 or before their first sexual encounter. Actually, the three-dose series can begin as early as age 9 if the patient appears to be at risk for sexual exposure, right? So the catch-up vaccination can also be performed for females ages 13 to 26 if they have not been fully vaccinated. However, we have a question here. What if the woman has already been given HPV? Does that mean that they are already exempted from getting regular cervical cancer screening using a pap smear? The answer is no, because the vaccine does not prevent all subtypes of the human papillomavirus. And there are many, many different subtypes of the human papillomavirus. So we're done with cervical cancer screening and prevention, but how about for ovarian cancer? It's the fifth leading cause of cancer-related death for women, and most are diagnosed already at a late stage. However, unlike cervical screening, in which you could do a pap smear with HPV testing, with DNA testing, with ovarian cancer, there are no effective screening tests. So for this, you only have to ask certain related symptoms. So important symptoms, for example, for those who are more than 50 years old include abdominal distension, abdominal bloating, and urinary frequency. There are also certain risk factors such as family history, obesity, nulliparity, and postmenopausal hormone replacement therapy. Family history includes the presence of genetic mutations, BRCA1 and BRCA2. Okay. You may have a decreased risk of ovarian cancer if you have used oral contraceptives before, because the risk of ovarian cancer increases with the number of ovulations. So, given that, if you have um, more pregnancies, then you have less ovulations because you do not ovulate during the period of pregnancy and immediately postpartum, right? Of course, if you have breastfed your children, you also do not ovulate. Okay. Moving on now from cancer to various infectious diseases. The rates in the US of sexually transmitted illnesses are some of the highest in the industrialized world. One of the most commonly reported STIs in women is chlamydia trachomatis. It could cause pelvic inflammatory disease. Okay? Chlamydia and gonorrhea have to be screened for all sexually active women less than 25 years of age and also for those older women with certain risk factors, for example, sex workers. So pregnant women have to be screened for chlamydia, syphilis, hepatitis B, and HIV because these infectious agents could also affect their developing fetus. HIV testing has to be done for all adults and adolescents, whether male or female, in between age 13 to 64. Of course, you need to do more frequent HIV testing for high-risk individuals. As I have mentioned, those who are engaged in sex work. Our next health promotion topic is family planning. Almost half of US pregnancies are actually unintended. Therefore, it is important to counsel girls about their options for contraception. Okay? So, some methods are more effective than others. But of course, um, some uh, some measure of family planning is better rather than none at all, right? So even if they are less effective, we need to still encourage our patients to use these methods. The most effective methods means that they have a less than 1% failure rate. This includes an intrauterine device, a subdermal implant, female sterilization, as well as vasectomy. Pills and injectables are actually just moderately effective, including vaginal ring as well as the diaphragm. And lastly, the least effective methods with very high failure rates are male and female condoms, withdrawal, sponge fertility awareness methods, and spermicides. But despite being less effective than the others, there's also a cultural component there as well. So, for example, here in the Philippines, if you have a devout Catholic patient, they may not be accepting of the more highly effective methods. So, but if you encourage withdrawal, maybe it's more palatable for them. So, you need to still tailor this to patient preferences. And our last health promotion topic is about hormone replacement therapy. You're only going to consider hormone replacement therapy if the woman with menopause is having problems regarding their symptoms. Okay, why? Because hormone replacement therapy actually increases risk for certain conditions such as stroke, thromboembolic events, gallbladder disease, urinary incontinence, and breast cancer, as well as probable dementia. But of course, hormone replacement therapy also decreases the risk for certain conditions such as fractures and breast cancer. Okay? So in other words, for managing the menopausal vasomotor symptoms such as hot flashes, HRT use needs to be individualized at a low dose and only for the shortest acceptable durations. You can only do HRT for around 1 to 2 years. Because otherwise, it's going to lead to an increase the risk for various cardiovascular conditions. Okay? So now that we're done with the anatomy and physiology, history taking, as well as self promotion, let's look at how we do the pelvic examination. So, for the patient needs to avoid intercourse, douching, or vaginal suppositories for around 24 to 48 hours beforehand. She also needs to empty her bladder beforehand. Unless, of course, we're going to do an ultrasound later on, in which case the bladder should be full. The patient lies supine with their head and shoulders elevated, the arms at their sides and folded across the chest. Meanwhile, the examiner, of course, should obtain permission, and especially if the patient is minor and if the examiner is a male, then the examiner should select a chaperone beforehand. The examiner should also explain each step of the examination and drape the patient appropriately. And because the patient is located is at a vulnerable position, the examiner should avoid any unexpected or sudden movements. And the speculum, the one that you use to open the patient's vulva, have to be warmed beforehand with tap water. The pelvic examination has these three steps: external exam, the internal exam, and the bimanual exam. In the external exam, of course, you examine the external portion of the female genital tract. You look at the vulva. You examine the mons pubis, the labia majora and minora, as well as the perineum. You need to separate the labia in order to be able to inspect the clitoris, the urethral meatus, as well as the introitus. For inspection, you need to do palpation. Palpate if there are any lesions and note if there is any swelling with the Bartholin glands. Next, you take your speculum. You need to select the appropriate speculum. The smallest one is called the virginal. It's because it's used for um, women without intercourse, without prior intercourse. So, you need to select the appropriate speculum, warm it, and then gently insert it in a downward angle towards the posterior vaginal wall. Once fully inserted, um, you open the blades to visualize the cervix. You inspect the cervix, and if you're going to do a pap smear, then you do it at this point. And slowly withdraw it while inspecting the vaginal walls. Okay? And lastly is the bimanual exam. Bi means two, manual means hands. So you use your two hands to do the bimanual exam. How do you do it? You insert a lubricated index and middle finger into the vagina. Then you place the other hand on the abdomen. You do this in order to push the cervix downwards, and you palpate the cervix and then the uterus in between your hands. From there, you move to the lateral fornices to palpate the ovaries and the nexa. This point as well, you also need to assess the muscle strength of the pelvic floor. What are some of the lesions of the external genital tract you're going to encounter? It's a small, firm, round yellowish cystic nodule located in the labia with a dark punctum marking the blocked gland opening. It could be an epidermoid cyst. If it's a firm, painless ulcer from primary syphilis, it is called a chancre. So it forms 21 days after exposure and it heals in around 3 to 6 weeks. Okay. If in genital herpes, the lesions are shallow, small, and painful on red bases. Recurrent outbreaks are also common. Even real wart called a condyloma acuminatum that is caused by human papillomavirus appears as a warty lesion on the labia and within the vestibule. Secondary syphilis leads to a lesion called condyloma latum. It appears as a large, raised, round or oval, flat-top, gray or white contagious lesion. Lastly, carcinoma of the vulva is going to appear as an ulcerated or raised red vulvar lesion, usually in an elderly woman, usually squamous cell carcinoma. Next, what are the possible causes of bulges and swellings in the vulva, vagina, and urethra? Cystocele is a bulge of the upper two-thirds of the anterior vaginal wall, along with the bladder above it, from weakened support tissues. So, cysto refers to the bladder. In contrast, a rectocele is a herniation of the rectum into the posterior wall of the vagina and is caused by a weakness in the endopelvic fascia. Bartholin gland infection is a tense, hot, and very tender abscess caused by trauma or infection. Chronically, it can be a non-tender cyst. And lastly, a caruncle, specifically a urethral caruncle, is a small red benign tumor visible at the posterior urethral meatus, common among postmenopausal women. If the patient has any discharge, what would lead you to the diagnosis is the characteristic of the discharge. So here we have three conditions: trichomonal vaginitis, the candida vaginitis, and bacterial vaginosis. Okay. So the appearance of the discharge is going to differ depending on the cause. So for example, if it's trichomonal vaginitis, then the discharge is going to be yellowish, green or gray, frothy, malodorous, and profuse. Aside from that, there may be associated pruritus and dyspareunia. For this, in order to have a diagnosis of Trichomonas vaginitis, then you need to see the motile trichomonads in a saline wet mouth. In contrast, if the condition is caused by Candida, Candida is a yeast. The appearance is going to be more whitish and curdy. It has been compared to cottage cheese before. So it's thicker and its smell is not as bad as the other causes. Here, the prominent finding is more of an intense pruritus. It's going to be more itchy more than anything. And you could diagnose it by doing a potassium hydroxide preparation, a KOH preparation, and you need to visualize there the characteristic branching hyphae of the candida. And lastly, for bacterial vaginosis is more of an imbalance in terms of the bacterial composition in the vulva. Here, the odor is characteristically fishy. And unlike Trichomonas, which is more yellowish green, and Candida, which is more curdy, cheese-like, bacterial vaginosis have a more white and thin discharge. The prominent finding is more of the fishy odor, especially after intercourse. So you diagnose it using a wet mouth as well. So with trichomonal vaginitis, you see motile trichomonas, but with bacterial vaginosis, you see clue cells. Clue cells are epithelial cells which are covered by bacteria. You could also have a positive whiff test. When you lower the pH, when you apply potassium hydroxide, it's going to have as characteristic ammoniacal odor. So it's called a positive whiff test. Also, the pH of the vaginal discharge is going to be abnormal. Instead of the usual acidic, it's going to be slightly more alkaline. Okay, so before we end, let's quickly run through the different abnormalities of the cervix, the uterus, as well as the adnexae, starting with the cervix. So for the cervix, you could have infections. So it's called mucopurulent cervicitis, usually secondary to a sexually transmitted pathogen such as chlamydia, gonorrhea, or herpes. So when this happens, then the woman may have a purulent yellowish drainage from the cervical os. For cancers, for carcinoma of the cervix, it usually begins, or typically begins at the area of metaplasia, at the cervico squamocolumnar junction, at the border between the ectocervix and the endocervix. Initially, without a pap smear, it may be difficult to distinguish a normal cervix from a cancerous cervix. However, later stages may show an extensive, irregular, cauliflower-like growth. And lastly, we have a condition that is secondary to intake of a medication. Here, the medication is diethylstilbestrol or DES. But take note that the ones who get cancers from the ethylstilbestrol are not those women who took it, but their daughters. So their daughters are at risk for abnormalities. Okay? For abnormalities of the uterus, you could have tumors. The most common benign tumor is a myoma, also known as a fibroid. They feel like a firm, irregular nodule continuous with the uterine surface. So maybe you see this in some women in your community. We have the Filipino colloquial term for them is mapuson. So mapuson, the women who are mapuson may have a benign tumor, usually a myoma, also known as a fibroid. Among elderly women, we have also a folk condition, a folk illness called BUWA or prolapse of the uterus, organ prolapse. So the scientific term is POP. Here, the uterus deserves down the vaginal canal. There are various degrees of prolapse. The least severe is first degree pelvic organ prolapse, in which the cervix is still located within the vagina. Second degree is the cervix is already located at the introitus, so you could visualize it already. And third degree is what also known as procidentia, in which the cervix and vagina are already located outside. In other words, um, the cervix and vagina have been turned inside out. And that's because of the weakness in the pelvic floor muscles. And lastly, the adnexae. What are the adnexae again? It includes the fallopian tubes as well as the ovaries. So the ovaries tend to be smooth and compressible. In contrast, tumors are more solid and nodular in texture. So ovarian cancer may have the following symptoms: pelvic pain, bloating, as well as increased abdominal size. There's also another condition called PCOS or PCOS or polycystic ovary syndrome. It involves ovulatory dysfunction, androgen excess, and polycystic ovaries on ultrasound. So you see this sometimes. So if you see a hairy woman, most commonly it's secondary to a polycystic ovary. It's because of the excess hormones, specifically male hormones or androgens. An ectopic pregnancy is implantation of the fertilized ovum outside the uterus. Usually, it happens in the fallopian tube. Okay? So, the egg cell usually meets the sperm at the infundibulum of the fallopian tube. But after meeting, the implantation should occur in the body of the uterus. However, when that doesn't happen, then it lead to an ectopic pregnancy. Ectopic pregnancy, of course, is dangerous because the fetus is growing and could damage the structures around it. Okay, so it has to be addressed surgically by the obstetrician. All right. Lastly, we have pelvic inflammatory disease. An ascending infection of microbes from the cervix and vagina could lead to infection to the endometrium, the fallopian tube, as well as the adjacent structures. Okay. So the hallmarks of this would be adnexal cervical motion tenderness and uterine compression tenderness. In other words, when you do your bimanual examination, if there's any pain during that, then that could be secondary to a pelvic inflammatory disease. In some extreme cases, the microbes could form an abscess called a tubo-ovarian abscess. And of course, if it remains unaddressed, that could lead to infertility or inability to rear a child. All right. That's it. That's all for our lectures for today. Thank you very much for listening, everyone. If you have any questions, just ask me. Thank you.